The thousands of people seated in the Royal Festival Hall in London, England, are about to witness a performance that one critic called captivating. A man who has twice traveled the road, first as a Pied Piper, now as a legend. But the legend was yet to come. For the time is February 1974, and it would still be months before the word spread in his own homeland. The word was already out in England and on the continent. He was coming back, through the back door, from England, the land whose music had once toppled him. But the English don't seem to forget, and tonight they would celebrate the fact. Sedaka's back. This is the Robert W. Morgan Special of the Week. This week, we'll be taking a special look at a story that one man considers something akin to a second coming. The story, Neil Sedaka.
Again, they said, "You gotta be kidding. This is the worst thing we ever heard." I said, "I think it's going to be a hit." Thank God I was right.
Neil is the one that sort of sneaks in with the brown sock and the blue sock and pants that are 4 times too big because he likes to be comfortable. And will sit down at the piano and they say, "Hey, well, that's Neil Sedaka."
He could be God if he wanted to. And he's got such a good heart and such a good man. He's got this thing going on around him that we all have, you know, and it's been hard for him. He's had a very difficult life. But God, man, he's like Stevie Wonder. He's like Elton John. They write melodies. They write songs. There's form to the songs. There aren't jams. They're honest-to-God statements.
He talks to me about his problems, and I can talk to him. I can confide in him. He's a good father, really.
Neil Sedaka, born of immigrant parents and growing up in a neighborhood in Brooklyn that he defines as lower middle-class Jewish. It was here that Neil's quest for acceptance began. Acceptance didn't come easy for Neil because even then, he was different. You wouldn't find him on the streets with the other kids. He was inside with his music. The kid's first big break in show business came one magic moment in the 2nd grade. At the age of 7, Neil was asked by his teacher to conduct the choir. As Neil recalls, it wasn't a sterling performance, but he must have been doing something right. That night, his parents got a call. Their son bore watching. He had talent. It was musical, and they should get him a piano.
But at 8 years old, it was kind of a very regimentated life in the fact that I practiced 4 or 5 hours a day on my classical music. Except I wasn't the type of child that had to be forced to practice. I enjoyed it myself. I had to have the meals brought to the piano.
And kids can be mean when they're 8, especially if you're different.
I didn't play baseball. I was not accepted by kids my own age. Therefore, I think I turned to music for that reason, to get acceptance from teenagers. I was not sports orientated. I wasn't exactly the most popular kid in school. Remember the sweet shop across the street from Abraham Lincoln High School was divided in 2. The first half was for what I called the finer kids, and the second half were the leather hitters and the real toughies. And there's where the jukebox was, and there's where Fats Domino played, and Chuck Berry and Little Richard. And I was not accepted in the second half of the sweet shop until I wrote a song called Mr. Moon. I was a freshman in high school in 1952. And Mr. Moon was a sensation, so much so that the principal of Lincoln refused to let me go on the second show because it caused me a riot. The kids got up and started to dance, and it was the first time really that rock and roll came to Abraham Lincoln High School. It was a hushed thing for a couple of years because it was always known that rock and roll would bring out the animalistic tendencies in people, and it was just very no-no.
No-no really was the word from Eleanor Sedaka. What did this pop music, this rock and roll, have to do with her son? A serious boy, a student of the classics at the world-famous Juilliard Institute. Well, Mom was about to have a baptism under fire because of a neighbor. Etta Greenfield had heard Neil play and suggested collaboration with her son, the poet. As Neil remembers, the first time Howie Greenfield knocked on his door and suggested writing a song together, Neil's first reaction was, "You gotta be nuts." But he wasn't, and they did. As a matter of fact, they finished a song that very afternoon. In the beginning, it was all undercover. Songs were written while Mom was out shopping. Neil told no one at Juilliard, where he continued to go daily, another place where rock and roll was certainly a no-no. As far as anyone knew, Neil was a serious student of the classics, and still is.
I can still play the Blackie Etude, the Revolutionary Etude of Chopin. I do the Wallstein Piano Sonata. I studied with some great teachers at Juilliard, Adele Marcus.
By the time Neil could pass the audition to study with Adele Marcus, he was also auditioning other music on the other side of town, and he was beginning to get some action. In fact, it began taking up more and more of his time. So much time that he began to miss lessons. And you don't miss many lessons with Adele Marcus without her wanting to know why. And so it came to pass. The showdown at the Steinway.
When he came for one given lesson, I said, "What's wrong, Neil? Why are you missing so many lessons?" He said, "Well, the reason I've missed so many lessons is due to the fact that I have a lyricist, and we've been working on songs, and one song hit a minor jackpot in London. 90,000 copies were sold of my piece called Stupid Cupid." Well, I was very, very taken with the title, and I said to him, "Play it for me." "Oh," he said, "you don't want to hear that stuff, do you?" I said, "Play it."
Connie Francis, with the song that gave Neil the first real taste of what rock and roll could do. Neil Sedaka would never be the same. A young Neil Sedaka had dropped his study of serious music at Juilliard to pursue in earnest the kind of music that had been gnawing at his soul. Neil Sedaka was standing at the crossroads. A momentous decision for a young man to make, but the drive within Neil would allow for nothing else. He'd reached the crossroads and taken the beginning steps in a new direction. Everyone knew by this time, with one exception, Neil's family. With his classical music, he had tremendous support from both his parents and older sister Ronnie. Telling Adele Marcus was one thing, telling Mom quite another. I asked Neil if he remembered that day.
Vividly. I asked my mother for a 6-month leave of absence from Juilliard. She near had a coronary. She said, "What do you expect to do?" And my sister Ronnie said, "What do you expect to do? There are millions of people who can sing and write songs equally as well, if not better." I said, "Well, I've been peddling these demo songs with success. By that time, I'd had Stupid Cupid, Connie Francis, and I Waited Too Long, Laverne Baker, Since You've Been Gone, Clyde McPhatter, some local New York hits. And I said, I just have this feeling. Give me 6 months. If I don't do it in 6 months' time, then I'll go back to school.
Neil didn't even need 6 months because he turned all his energies and concentration in one direction, writing songs. On the very day he told his family about his dream, Neil was to write a song that would change his life forever.
I remember my mother was ironing. This is the day that I told her that I wasn't going to school. And I sat at the piano and I said, "This is it, Neil. Either you're going to do it or you're not." And I wrote a tune that was inspired by Villa-Lobos, the South American composer. Howie Greenfield came in, and I said, "I want the name Carol." I had been seeing Miss Klein, who became Carole King. I said, "There's something about a song with a girl's name." I said, "Give me your worst lyric." He said, "What, are you kidding me? Da, 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 da. I have to develop, I have to grow," and as it should have been. He wrote a very, very simple lyric to my very, very simple tune, and it started like da 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 da. I like
it. Was the beginning of an era. Rock and roll had just been born, and over the next 4 years, Neil Sedaka and Howie Greenfield were to write the music that would set a whole generation dancing, singing, laughing, and crying. It might have been called the Sedaka era, but if you had to put a name on it, the Brighton Beach era might be the proper title. This area of Brooklyn was to produce some of the real giants of American music. Gathered at Abraham Lincoln High School were not only Neil and Howie Greenfield, but also their friends, people like Carole King, Paul Simon, and a small, wiry kid named Neil Diamond. On any given evening, you might find this group hanging out in a corner, singing those songs and talking about rock and roll. This was when it was all for fun. When it turned serious, this whole group would find their way to a single building in New York City. At the Brill Building, they found others of their own kind. Jerry Goffin, the late Al Nevins, Cynthia Wilde and Barry Mann, Tony Orlando, rock impresario Don Kirshner, Ellie Greenwich, Phil Spector, Paul Anka, and Art Garfunkel. And Neil remembers.
Great training. The Brill Building period was a great training as a writer, because that was a place to go to write your songs. Sometimes it's difficult to write in a house, your natural surroundings. You've got to make it a job. So I went to the Brill Building 5 days a week, 4 or 5 hours a day, and sat at the piano with Howie Greenfield. This was it for me. I was a songwriter. It was great training.
The days were busy and hectic, but it didn't stop Neil from continuing a relationship begun a few years earlier. By now, Neil was a seasoned performer, gathering his skills like so many before him in the mountain resorts surrounding New York City. It was at one of these watering holes that Neil would meet a 16-year-old girl named Liba.
I met Neil in 1958. My parents had a hotel in the Catskill Mountains of New York State, and Neil had the orchestra, all 4 pieces. And he played piano, cut the shows, played dance music, and Wednesday and Saturday played mambo music on an accordion at the swimming pool.
Despite the fact that Neil's career was already underway, Liba hadn't heard of him or Stupid Cupid, and even then had a mind of her own.
Actually, I was attracted to the trumpet. No, not the trumpet player, the saxophone player who's a dentist today. But Neil said he saw me behind the desk, and he said to the trumpet player, "I'm going to marry that girl."
This was a celebration that wouldn't take place for several years. After all, Liba was still in high school, and Neil was just getting started. They began to date, and before she knew it, Liba was up to her eyeballs in Neil Sedaka. Neil, of course, was spending lots of time on the road. Her locker began to look like a music magazine, plastered with articles on Neil and the ever-present charts. Liba began using her study hall time to answer the fan mail. Her grade suffered some, but the fan mail went out on schedule. For a girl from Monticello, New York, this was another world, and not necessarily one where a schoolgirl's dreams come true. She and Neil were late to the high school prom because Neil had a Dick Clark show to do. At the height of his career, Neil decided he wanted to date other girls. Though crushed, Liba agreed. And by the time Neil had decided that Liba was the girl for him, it was hard to convince her. As a matter of fact, when he called, she didn't believe him. It took a phone call from good friends Frankie Valli and producer Hank Medress to convince her that Neil was indeed serious. And even then, it was a rocky road.
When we finally decided, yes, we are getting married, his manager at the time decided that teenage idols, quote unquote, do not get married. I don't know what they do, but they don't get married. So the wedding had to be a secret. The marriage had to be a secret. And for the first 2 years of our married life, I traveled as Neil's sister, cousin, aunt, grandmother, and it's embarrassing to travel as a maiden aunt when you're 8 months pregnant. My passport was in my maiden name when we checked into hotels in foreign countries, and I felt that was traumatizing. I was conditioned that when Neil was mobbed by the fans, so to speak, I had to stand 6 steps to the back. I really feel for Prince Philip.
Neil Sedaka is married, though few people know it. They do know the string of Sedaka hits. What they don't know is that there was a new sound about to sweep the world. Lost in a fast shuffle were Neil Sedaka, several thousand other piano pounders, guitar benders, horn blowers, teen idols, some 3,000 girls of easy virtue, most of the American recording industry, and 27 kids from Santa Monica who used to make a pretty good living in the beach blanket movies. Neil Sedaka is riding the crest of his career, just barely into his 20s, a supply of hits seemingly endless, nightclub and television performances, concerts around the world, international fame, a beautiful young wife, And yet, the writing was already on the wall.
On my honeymoon, Leva and I went over on the old Queen Elizabeth from New York to London, Southampton, and there was a jukebox, and I heard the Beatles for the first time, the Liverpool sound. I think it was Del Shannon had a cover record of the song. This is pre I Want to Hold Your Hand and pre those. From Me to You. Is it anything that you want? I said, isn't that nice? The English have a conception of our rock and roll. I thought it was very cute.
Well, hello, hello. The English said hello to Neil Sedaka, Dion and the Belmonts, Chubby Checker, Frankie Avalon, Frankie Valli, Paul Anka, Fabian, the Everly Brothers, and 1,000 others. Within 2 years, everyone knew, including Neil.
I knew that my hit records had stopped. I was prepared for that. I knew that it would not last. The Beatles came in and changed everything. I loved them, and I wanted to keep up with those sounds, but it was record executives who insisted that I stay to the same formula kind of song, which was a grave mistake, because you can just milk it so much and then it's too repetitious.
The entire American record industry was grinding to a halt. Change was hard to come by. Too many people were scared. In some cases, not knowing what to do, they did nothing. And when you do nothing, someone's going to eat your lunch. Since lunch had been served, Neil, Liba, and daughter Dara went home. It was that same hunger, the hunger for acceptance and recognition.
I used to tell people that I was in real estate just to avoid going through the whole rigmarole of the fact that my records had stopped selling. I was putting out records, but they sat on a shelf. They were never played on the radio. But I had, this is after, let me see, the last chart record was The Closest Thing to Heaven. There was a Bad Girl that made number 40-something. Then there was a Dreamer that went to the 50s. There was Sunny that went to the 90s. And The Closest Thing to Heaven, the 100. And that was it. Then I stopped recording rather than just put out records.
It was over. Oh, Neil still had a hand in the business, continuing to write, and he even produced some hits. The Fifth Dimension scored with his Working on a Groovy Thing. Tom Jones had a winner with Puppet Man, but the hits didn't come nearly as often. They were written for others, and Neil had almost stopped performing. There was one thing, that offer from England for some club dates. And the more Neil thought about it, the more he liked it. Neil hoped the English would like it too, because Sedaka still had a lot to say. Would I make you smile if I came back in style? Those words would live with Neil for the next couple of years. They called them the Misty Isles, known for cold, wet weather and a very reserved public. Why then would Neil Sedaka want to go to England with his music?
I went to England to do some clubs in the north, some cabarets in the north. I felt that the English people were very faithful fans. They remembered all of the records. They remembered my appearance in 1961 at the Palladium. And if any place, it would be England that would recognize my contemporary music.
And he seems to have a knack for choosing the right way to go. Sedaka soon found his instincts had been right. The reception he found in England was open, warm, and more than friendly. They did remember, like superstar drummer Nigel Olsson.
He's one of my idols, you know, when I was a small kid, you know. And now to be able to say I've played on his hit record, you know, it's a great feeling, you know. It makes you feel real good when you hear it come on the radio. This is Neil Sedaka. And you can say, that's me in the background, banging away.
The English grapevine began to hum. He's here, he's accessible, and he's working. And that's all it took. Neil began to work with more of the innovators, the people who make fresh things happen. The longer he stayed in England, the more people sought him out. Neil was on a short trip to the States when one Englishman wouldn't even wait for him to return.
He said he had a group called Hot Legs that owned their own studio, Strawberry Studios. Hot Legs eventually became 10cc. He asked me to do 2 cuts with them while I was working up in Manchester area. I did. I was totally knocked out, and I wound up doing an entire album with them called the Solitaire album. Then I did a second album with them in the 70s, early 70s, called The Tra-La Days Are Over. The Solitaire album did Zippo, Nothing. We released a couple of singles from it, which were hits in England. That's When the Music Takes Me and Standing on the Inside. And then I put out The Tra-La Days Are Over, which was the second album that I did with 10cc.
My God, it was going good. Neil was selling records in England and the rest of Europe. He was performing, but there was still something nagging at him. He couldn't get arrested at home, and it bothered him. The words he wrote in England would mirror the frustration of that one mountain left to climb. It's that need, that drive that makes the great ones, and Neil longed to sing the news that he was standing on the inside again. But Neil Sedaka would need a catalyst to break the circle and cross the line. No one in America wanted to sign him, but there was someone watching and listening all the time. Elton John liked what he heard and wanted to hear more.
He called me in 1974 when I was spending 3 months a year in England. He called me and said he wanted to come over to hear the record that I had just finished with the 10cc's. My son almost passed out on the floor. He turned whiter than he is, and he's very white, because here was the Elton John walking into our apartment in London. He was gracious, natural, wonderful. He sat at the piano and played for many hours, and we found that we had a lot in common, both being classical pianists, both being composers, both having kind of that introverted childhood. And we immediately became friends.
The friendship began to grow, and it proved to be the real turning point on the road back to the States. The Sedaka swell was picking up more momentum in England. Liba Sedaka recalls.
They loved him. They accepted him. And it worked. It worked thanks to Fred Gershon, who was Neil's friend since he was 4 years old and our attorney today, who said, Elton is your friend. Elton has Rocket Records. Why don't you tell Elton to take the masters and put them out in this country? And that's how it happened.
And the deal was set. Neil would be coming home on Rocket Records. The moment he had been waiting for arrived. It had been a long time coming, and Neil still wondered if anyone would care. Neil Sedaka is coming home on an English record label. The first thing to grab America's interest was the fact that Elton John was behind the move. The American record industry had decided a long time before that Neil would be fun in an oldies show, but to sell records, that was another story. Until that first record was released. It got off to a slow start, but once it took off, there was little doubt that it was going to be a smash. It also became apparent that things had changed. For many years, Neil had been writing with Howard Greenfield, but during the last couple of years, he'd been collaborating with the man who did the lyric for Laughter in the Rain. His name, Phil Cody. Phil, like Neil, had chosen music over furthering his formal education. Like Neil, he had to face his immigrant parents with the news. They took it very hard, and for some time their relationship was very strained. I asked Phil if things had improved over the years.
Oh yeah, I get along really well with my father and my mother. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons I wrote The Immigrant kind of as a peace offering. At one point, I looked at where my folks were. They'd come to this country from Europe, I guess with ideals of great things happening. My father came here to be an opera singer and failed. And it was largely through his influence that I first got interested in music, because he was singing all the time. And I kind of wanted to give him a gift, of a song. So The Immigrant took place.
If there was any doubt left after Laughter in the Rain and The Immigrant, it was soon dispelled by two new record artists, The Captain and Tennille. Tony Tennille remembers.
We had the album just about done when we went into Kip Cohen's office one day, who's the vice president of A&R at A&M. And he played for us a cut on Neil Sedaka's album, Sedaka's Back, and said, how do you like this song? And of course, by the time it was over, we were all jumping around the office. It's such a cute song. So Daryl and I went in the studio the next day and cut it.
Sedaka was back, this time to stay. But this time, he was in charge, and things were going to change with the times.
I had 4 hit singles and 2 hit albums. The second hit album was Laughter in the Rain, because I felt I didn't want to get into the same rut again of all the records sounding alike. So I did Laughter in the Rain in California. I called up an American friend of mine, Kenny Young, who was living in London, and I said, where should I record in California? I haven't recorded in America in 10 years. And he said, Robert Appere, Clover Studios on Santa Monica Boulevard.
With some of the finest musicians, including Nigel Olsson, Neil began to record with producer Robert Appere.
Neil is probably the most professional artist that I've ever worked with. His albums are done in 9 days. Live vocals while he's playing the piano. And it's just bang, 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 usually the first or second take.
There have been few comebacks in the history of pop music to equal Neil Sedaka's. We went to a man who has been with Neil for 18 years, rock impresario Don Kirshner, to get the reasons.
With Anka coming back and Bobby Vinton, Benny King and Frankie Valli, the timing was right. And that topped with Elton John's Belief and the Rocket Record and MCA Belief, and what little help we gave along the way. I think he had a strong team behind him.
Everyone seems to have the same answer. It's the man. It's Neil Sedaka. When it all seemed to be over, he fought back.
Every time I'm afraid of something, or every time I'm an underdog, or I don't accomplish what I'd like to, it gives me more fight. And that's what the creative ability is. It is kind of a drive that you have to sit down and write. You have to continue along, because if you don't, you're going to just dwindle.
It's the second time around. How does Neil feel about sustaining his career?
It's a very changing business. It's a very fickle business. There are seat warmers, backslappers. When you're a winner, they love you. It is one of those things. And if you put everything in the right perspective, I think you have a pretty good shot.
It's been a long wait, but Neil Sedaka has proven that it's no fluke. He's broken the circle and stepped over that line. Neil Sedaka is standing on the inside again. I'm Robert W. Morgan. You've been listening to our Special of the Week. We've spent an hour with Neil Sedaka, written and produced by Susan and Don Clark. Our director was Lee Hansen. Our engineer, Steve Booth. Executive producer, Tom Rounds. The Special of the Week is produced and distributed by Watermark Incorporated.